from the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Okay, we're rolling. Today is Wednesday, July 13, 2011. My name is Joe Mosnier of the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm in Washington, D.C. in the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress with videographer John Bishop, and we are here to complete an oral history interview for the Civil Rights History Project, which is a joint undertaking of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we're especially pleased and honored today to have with us both Mr. Simeon Booker on the right on the screen and Mr. Moses Newson, two gentlemen with long histories of engagement with the civil rights era and beyond and before as journalists. So Mr. Newson, Mr. Booker, thank you very much for troubling to make the trip here today and sitting down. Thank you.
Good to be here.
I thought I might start, Mr. Booker, with just having you tell us a little bit about your entry into your professional journalistic work. When you joined in 1942, you joined the Afro-American as a reporter at $18 a week.
Well, I was just trying to think back that far. I was quite close to the Afro because the publisher, Carl Murphy, and my uncle, J.H.N. Warren Jr., the principal of Downingtown Industrial School in Pennsylvania, were classmates at Harvard. And so I always had a yearning for journalism and because of Carl Murphy. And a yearning to go to Harvard because of their joint studies there.
Indeed, you would go in the early 50s to Harvard as a Nieman Fellow.
I did eventually, but I started off working as a reporter on the
Call and Post.
Well, the Call Post, but I went from the Afro to the Call Post. Then I applied for a Harvard Nieman and won a Nieman while I was at the Call Post. When I finished, I then made up my mind I wanted not to go back to Call Post, but to go to Washington Post, which I thought would be an advancement. But when I talked to the publisher, he said that come, and I'll give you a job when vacancy occurred. So I worked in the government as a clerk for a few months till the opening came. But then when the opening came, I found that being at the Post, I was way so far down the ladder that all my background experience at Harvard was of no use. I was covering like a cub reporter. So then I decided to leave and go with John H. Johnson, who was opening up a small pocket magazine called Jet, and I went to Chicago. And after a few years there, he decided to open a Washington bureau, and he named me in charge of finding the candidate. So I chose myself and came to Washington.
I think that was an excellent hire.
Yeah,
very good job you did that. Yeah. Well, let me pick that story back up in just a minute, but I want to turn to Mr. Newson and ask a little bit about kind of your entry into your professional journalistic work. I know that as a young man you entered the U.S. Navy and went on from there.
Yes, and after I came out of the Navy, I stuck around a while and did some work with my father. And I had always been interested in a lot of the newspapers that we got from different places, Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and some of those. They were telling quite a different story from what we got in the state paper. At that time, down in Florida, most everybody was taking the Time Union out of Jacksonville. And I saw a lot of things, a lot of stories that interest me, and being someone who's sort of interested in helping people and maybe trying to help change the situation we were living under at that time. I chose that as a good field to go into. And I started out at Storer College in West Virginia for a while, and then went to the School of Journalism at Lincoln University in Missouri, and graduated there in the summer of 1952. And my first job was with the Tri-State Defender in Memphis.
Yeah.
And that was one of the Defender's chain papers. And spent 5 years there doing some of everything.
Yeah.
Covered anything and everything that came along.
Sure. These were years, obviously, when the pace and emphasis of racial change was accelerating, but also meeting lots of early and very emphatic impediments. And I want to just ask a little bit about some of the early and substantial stories that you began to cover. Mr. Newson, I think when you were in Memphis with the Defender, you did work in both 55 in Clinton, in Hoxie, Arkansas, and then in 56 in Clinton, Tennessee. And I wonder if you can recall some of the details of those very early efforts at school desegregation.
Yeah, those were very interesting entries into coverage of school desegregation. At that time, we had heard a lot of things about how difficult it would be, and places where there were large numbers of black citizens were supposed to be some of the toughest areas. Places where there were small numbers of black were supposed to be pretty easy situations. Turned out not to be that way. In Hoxie, actually, media people were invited to come into the classrooms, ride the buses where the kids were coming in, talk to some of the teachers in the classrooms and that sort of thing. That was pretty unusual, and the fact of the matter is it didn't happen anywhere else that I went. It went along pretty smoothly there for a while, and as you know, they had people who went around trying to stir up problems. People such as Asia Carter and John Casper, and they got in there after the schools had got started and fired up a lot of people along with KKK and some of the others, and eventually they had a lot of problems there. Clinton was sort of a different story. At the time, there were about 5,000, maybe 4,000 people in the city. Only about 200 of them were black. And sort of a strange situation. That's a hilly country. Most of the black people there lived up on what they call Foley Hill. You went up one way and you drove around the area and you came back down the same way. They didn't have a high school there for blacks at all. So the blacks had to go to different counties to go to high school. And these kids who were going to integrate the school, they had to walk down this hill every morning. People would line up on both sides and yell stuff and throw stuff and that sort of thing. Back in those days, there was no public accommodation situation, and you had to find some place to stay when you were covering these stories. My situation in this case is that I was staying over in Knoxville, which is about 18 miles away. Every evening after things took place, I'd head back out to Knoxville. that's when the people would come down from the hills, you know, and they'd be shooting off guns and they'd be shooting off firecrackers and trying to intimidate people, that sort of thing. They had a lot of trouble inside the school, but eventually it worked out, and then it got bad. There was a minister, just to let you know how bad there was a white minister who walked down the hill one day with these kids, and he lost his job. He got chased out of town. Eventually, the governor had to call out the National Guard there to bring peace in that situation.
Yeah, yeah. Mr. Booker, I want to ask about, you were in Chicago in '55, had not yet moved to DC, I think. Is that right?
That's right.
When you first made your trip down, I think your first trip to Mississippi, as I have read, was to go down and to cover the work of two gentlemen, Gus Lee and Mr. George Lee, Pastor Lee, who were doing voter registration work in Humphreys County, Mississippi.
Well, I went down. Emmett Till was from Chicago.
Yeah.
Emmett Till. And when he was killed, I decided that would make a terrific story for Jet. So the photographer and myself decided we would go down to check on. I'd never been in the South. I was born in Baltimore, grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, and never covered the South at all. So going into Mississippi was completely new to me. And we went down to check on his death, how the two men had gone in and killed him because he whistled at a woman, I don't know, it was one of the wives or something. And we went down for that. And the South just was different from what I had expected.
You also, I think, had developed a very close journalistic connection to Mrs. Till, Mamie Till Bradley.
Yeah, I was with her. We went. I remember being with her when we stayed up all night waiting on the body to come in from Mississippi. And when it did come in, she demanded that the body be opened so the world could see what they did to my boy. And when they opened the casket in the funeral home, I remember a piece of his skull fell off, and my photographer went over and reached over and picked it up and put it back on before he shot a picture. And it was a very gruesome scene, but she was a tough lady.
Let me ask you many questions about kind of coming off that theme, but I wanted to ask about your photographer, David Jackson.
He was very good, a veteran photographer, and he could handle all of the emergencies that came up. In those days, the cameras were big. They weren't little where you could put in your pocket, you know. So it was a very dangerous thing to be a photographer and to work in the South. And he was a pretty brave fellow. He just dared to do anything.
Thinking about the Till case and about school desegregation, I'm interested in hearing from both of you thoughts about how the black press was evolving in the mid-'50s. '54 had been a very tough year with a recession and a lot of retrenchment in circulation figures for a lot of the black newspapers. And then these stories pulled the press forward in certain new ways. I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
Well, jet circulating just took off when they ran the picture. They had to reprint. First time they ever reprinted Jet magazine. And there was a lot of interest in that case. And in the entire black community was becoming aware of the need to do something about it.
Yeah. Mr. Newson, did you?
Yeah, I think starting with the school ruling in 1954, the South was always a pretty tough place, and places like Mississippi were just backwards, racially speaking. And we got this real hateful climate where people in the Congress and other leaders were speaking forcefully about the fact that they were not going to integrate schools, and we were having an awful lot of problems. You mentioned George Lee, one of the guys who was killed just for trying to get black folks to register to vote. He was actually one of two people who were killed in 1954, there just before, in 1955, just before Emmett Till was killed. And the thing about these murders is that nobody was being convicted. In neither of those two cases, nobody was convicted. I went down for the funeral of George Lee. And strangely enough, a lot of people went down because that was one of the first times that Roy Wilkins had taken over as head of the NAACP's operational body. And people wanted to see how tough he was going to be, how strong he was going to be down in Mississippi. But I think Mississippi had a reputation for being one of the worst places. And you were asking about the media. The two papers in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, to my mind, were some of the worst. There were a lot of bad ones as far as coverage of civil rights was concerned, but they were two of the worst. The entire climate, not just people being killed for doing the slightest type of things. The case with Emmett Till, he's supposed to have whistled at some woman, Bryant, who ran a store with her husband, Roy. It happened that they were out of town. The husband was out of town, and his half-brother, Milam, J.W. Milam, were out of town. They hadn't heard about that thing until one of Till's young friends mentioned it. So as soon as we heard about him being missing, that he had possibly whistled at a white woman, I went down and shot some pictures around. It was a little whistle-stop place, 4 or 5 stores and pretty much nothing else. And I interviewed the grandfather out in the cotton field where he was doing some work there. He really wanted to stay down. He said that was going to be one of his most profitable years, his shaft farming with this German guy. But his wife left immediately, headed back to Chicago, and it didn't take long in those days to get a trial underway. We just finished something that went on for 3 years or so. I think they killed him around August the 28th or something like that, and we were down there for the trial on September the 19th. So that was a very short period. It was, to me, I guess I was about 28 at the time. It was pretty tough situation down there. Some of the guys who were more veteran saw it a little different, but it was a pretty tense situation for me. I had gone down early and interviewed the sheriff, George Smith, whose guys actually made the arrest. But when we got over, he was someone you could talk to, you could interview. But when we got over where the trial was being held over in Tallahatchie County, it was a different story. We ran into Sheriff Strider. He hadn't done much of a job of trying to get witnesses to do something in the case. And I guess I was selected one day to go out and try to, with some NAAC people, to see if we could round up some witnesses who would be there. Actually, the sheriff was going to testify and did testify on behalf of the guys who had done the murder. But I went out, we changed clothes and went out wearing something like plantation workers would usually be wearing. We did round up a couple of people who did actually testify in the case. And I think it was important. The NAACP was pretty much handling that end of the case. And there was 3 people who went along. They were all NAACP people. Our driver was Medgar Evers, who drove us to all those backyard plantations and plains where we were trying to find witnesses back there. But it was quite interesting, and later, I think that night, some of the other press guys, black and white, went out with police officers and they made arrangements to have a couple of people testify in the trial.
Let's pause for just a minute here.
We're back.
Okay, we're back after a short break. Mr. Newson, you were talking about some of the strategies and approaches you used in and around Money, Mississippi during the trial. For example, changing clothes and going out to search for witnesses in that very unusual and exceptional situation. I'd be interested in having both of you talk a little bit about generally how your ideas and strategies for going into the communities in very tense situations as black reporters and doing work in very tense and potentially dangerous situations.
Well, we had just started a stringer system, and that was in all the rural areas of the South. We had people who would submit articles, ideas every week, and we would pay for the best one. Now, these people not only became informers for the article, but they also became informers for news developing and guides when we would come into their community reporting. So we developed a huge new audience in an area that had been forgotten. And I remember many times when these special stringers became the real sources of news, jet carried exclusively. We would send a photographer and reporter in, and this stringer would lead them around the community to where they wouldn't be hurt, and they could come up with exclusive news, which kept jet full. I also had a column, weekly column in jet, ticker tape, where I could run 2 or 3 sentences about little events that happened all across the country. I used this to carry more information that these stringers would send up that never got in the newspaper until Jet ran. And it amazed me how the community just sort of ignited, lit up over it. And it was very valuable for us.
Yeah, we had the stringer system too. I guess most of the publications did at that time because you didn't have a lot of bureaus in those places. Because we were so close to Mississippi, we were in and out of there an awful lot. When I talk about the culture down there, I think the Till case was a good example of the kind of culture you ran into when you were covering those kind of stories. I think a lot of the guys changed clothes quite often when they were down there. The search for witnesses was the only time that I had changed clothes. I always went the way I worked when I was at the office around town. But you ran into a situation where a lot of people were very helpful. Some people were scared to talk, you know, their jobs were at stake and that sort of thing. And people were somewhat beaten down because of the system. An example, of course, it was not just you know, little people on the street who would do things or say things, who would actually kill people sometimes. A lot of bodies were being found, and people were actually afraid. But the entire system worked that way. The courthouse where they were having the Till trial, of course it was segregated, you know, most of them were. But how did the press operate? The sheriff told us when we got there there'd be no integration in my courthouse. In addition to that, there was a press table there for white reporters and photographers and whatnot, but not for black reporters. We were, as often was the case, to sit in the audience and that sort of thing. Well, it happened that Congressman Charles Diggs from Detroit had come down as an observer, and he and some of the veteran reporters complained to the judge about the situation, and so eventually they did set up a table off to the side where reporters could work, and some of the other people who were there, lawyers and whatnot, sat at the same table over there. So that was a sort of condition that you worked under everywhere. You could hear what you could hear. I remember covering a case, rape case, where some whites were involved with having raped a co-ed down at Tallahassee, the University of Florida A&M. And most of the time I was sitting up in the balcony, you know, trying to hear as best you could. But quite often, that was just a situation. Every single facet of life was pretty much segregated. But you went out there to do a job, and most of us thought that it was very important because newspapers had a way of writing what they wanted to write and leaving out what they wanted to leave out. First time I saw a story about Till being killed, I was probably 2 or 3 inches in the Commercial Appeal or the Press Cemetery, one of the two there in Memphis. Mm-hmm. Once you get down there, it's a little different situation, and I was just appalled at how afraid people were to talk about the situation, and for good reason.
Yeah. Let me ask you both about what memories especially come to your mind when you think about the work you did covering Little Rock in '57.
Well, we were out at Little Rock very early with a team, photographer, reporter, and we stayed on that case. I got to know all the kids, their parents, even before the story broke like it did. And I think that's good to know stories like that and then write it so that people could get an idea of who these people were, what they were going through, rather than to say 6 kids showed up at the school. You got a chance to go to the inside and how the community rallied to help them keep up their morale. But another thing Jet did, it opened a Washington Bureau, and that was very unusual in those days. And we had a big bureau, so we covered Congress, we covered the different government departments, the program, and state governments, the government, legislatures, and we did a lot of material that gave us enough material to fill our magazine and to come up with unusual ideas for Emmett.
I think Little Rock turned out to be one of the most important of all the civil rights cases. It was sort of a long, drawn-out sort of situation. First off, arrangements had been made for the 9 youngsters who were selected to integrate the school. And on the verge of the day when they were supposed to enter school, Governor Farbers changed his mind and said school was not going to be integrated. To see that his orders were carried out, he called out the National Guard. My first day over there, I was walking across Park. School was located there at Park and 16th. And I was met by a colonel who came out and greeted me and told me that I wouldn't be able to work up there because my very presence might result in problems. Now, they had a bunch of white reporters over there and photographers and all that sort of thing. But to make sure that I got his message, he had some of his troops to escort me out of the area back to my car. And, you know, as it happened, you always pick up a couple of guys who are going to follow you, you know, with all kind of threats and that sort of thing. But there was just 2 of them, so I wasn't too worried about them. You know, I had my camera and the strobe unit and that sort of thing. But this situation in Little Rock, as Booker was explaining, we spent a lot of time hanging around the home of Elsie and Daisy Bates. Mrs. Bates was head of the NAACP, and she was the one who was actually working closest with the 9 students. And, you know, we'd hang around that paper, hang around the home. The kid would come in and dancing and doing what kids do, raiding the refrigerator and that sort of thing. So you did get to know them pretty well. But next time we were up there when kids were supposed to go to school, we bumped into this big crowd of people who were lined up on the streets out there. And there were 4 of us, myself and L. Alex Wilson, who had been my boss at the Tri-State Defender. This was my first story for the Afro-American newspapers in Baltimore. And as we went up, you know, the mob was saying things, and where you guys going, and you're never gonna get back from up there, and this kind of stuff. And we were pulling out ID cards and that kind of stuff. It didn't mean anything, and they told you, you know, that doesn't mean anything, you're black, and, you know, they were calling you all kind of names and that sort of thing. So eventually, someone from up front yelled that kids were getting into the school. They had come around another way, and that's when all hell broke loose. They started attacking us, and I suppose you've seen some of the pictures of L. Alex Wilson getting kicked and beat up, and guys climbing on his back and hitting him with bricks and that sort of thing. I was sort of walking at that time with Jimmy Hicks, who was with the Amsterdam News at the time. So we sort of ran along to stay out of the way of these guys. I just took a few licks, you know, that sort of thing. But L. Alex Wilson, I had worked with him for 5 years at the Defender, and I was trying to encourage him to come along with us. But it turned out that L. Alex Wilson had a problem with the KKK down in Leesburg, Florida, where I had gone to school after I reached the senior level. I didn't know Mr. Wilson, but we rode to and from work a lot of times down there, and we had a little incident one evening when we had stopped at an ice house down there, and problem came up, and he, after that, some guy was waving a gun at him, and he just walked slowly along, and I didn't know what was going on or what the situation was, so I jumped out and sort of interceded and told the guy we were leaving and getting away. But that was the first time that he told me that he had run into a problem with the KKK down in Florida. And he had run, and he made a pledge to himself that never again would he run under that sort of a situation. So that's why he wouldn't run at Little Rock, and that's why he got beat up pretty badly. And his wife, Emma Jean, she still thinks that the beating he took there sort of hastened his early demise. But the reason I say that was one of the most important of all the civil rights cases, that after they attacked us that day, with the NACP and others complaining about the fact that we weren't getting any protection down there, President Eisenhower decided to send in the military. And what that meant was that no more would people be able to use violence to actually prevent desegregation activities from taking place. And that was extremely important. As a matter of fact, I thought we would never see that sort of a situation again, but later, as I found out, going down to Mississippi at the case of James Meredith, people were still trying to do it the violent way. But that was an extremely important case, and it meant that people would have protection, both reporters, kids who were trying to get into these schools. They were some of the bravest kids that all over the country. They were absolutely fantastic, and people would say, why are you going out there? You know, if these kids would go out there, you had to be there too. One of the stories I always look back on is one morning when those kids weren't supposed to go to school. One of them didn't get the word, Elizabeth Eckford, and she got up there by herself, and the guard wouldn't let her through. I think at first she thought they would be friends of hers, but she realized eventually that they weren't, and she started to leave, and a group of white people surrounded her and just gave her a hard time, absolutely. And we weren't up there because they weren't supposed to be there that day. And as soon as I heard about it, I went out to her house and was talking to her. And, you know, she said something that a 15-year-old kid would say. I never thought people could be so cruel. And, you know, I made it the lead of my story, and it got played in the paper. Someone else also did a very good story on it. But those were the kind of things you would run into out there, and from time to time, you just had to stop writing and just listen to people talking about what they went through as individuals out there trying to just get an education.
Let's take a break for just a minute. Okay, we're back on after a short break. I want to ask you both about, before we turn to the Freedom Ride, I want to ask you both about, as far as you can recall, what was your mood about the prospects for race relations, say by the just the early '60s? Kennedy's been elected there in the fall of '60, and but you know, you'd seen things like Little Rock, pluses and minuses. I guess the pluses that Eisenhower exerted federal authority, but minuses are it's a pretty tough situation still. And do you recall what your mood about the prospects for race relations were?
Well, Eisenhower, he just, when it came to civil rights, was a blank. I remember after he went out of office, I went over to interview him at his retirement, and he said to me, of all the questions you asked me, all of them are on civil rights. And I said, now's my opportunity. I said, well, that was the one subject you never talked about while you're president. You always never came out. I give Kennedy credit, he started it. He got it going. And then, unfortunately, he got killed. And to show the difference, I was named a pallbearer at his funeral, something unheard of in those days.
Yeah.
But he really opened it up to the press. I had a seat in the second row. He really not only talked it, but he did things to show blacks, you're a part of this too.
Mr. Newson, do you remember your mood around the time of Kennedy's election? And
Yeah, I think everybody sort of expected somewhat more than what was actually done. They set a good mood with some of the speeches they were making and that sort of thing, which was good for the country because there had to be another voice out there besides what some of the media were doing and what some of the Southern lawmakers were doing and what they were saying, about pulling out of the Union and disobeying laws and that kind of stuff. We had a lot of different organizations working tirelessly, the NAACP and the Urban League and CORE, the young people in SNCC. Some of the most encouraging thing was some of the courts, some of the judges who started making some very important rulings, knocking down Jim Crow barriers, Johnson, Warren, and some of the others, who were very, very important in setting the stage for some of the progress that would take place later. All these things were encouraging. I don't know if anybody saw the changes coming the way they eventually came about as earlier, because now people talk about the 50s and the 60s, but people had been fighting a long, long time. This struggle had been going on for ages. People were getting killed out there. We had a family in North Florida get dynamited during one holiday season, Christmas holiday season. So it was not just that one period. But I do believe that when they killed Emmett Till, supposedly for whistling at a white woman, I think people took sort of a different attitude. Now they're killing our kids, and kids also took a little different attitude. I was a 14-year-old kid, and I think a lot of the young people began to become more assertive and more active. A lot of adults became more active in putting themselves on the line to help bring about some of the changes that would take place. People really don't know about a lot of the activities that were taking place, a lot of the prices that people paid. You know, I remember being at a little church greeting movement down in Mississippi, not too far from where Money was located. And we had people inside. We included some of the top civil rights people. The speaker there was a professor at Howard University. And outside, you have the police, the KKK, and others shooting people's pictures. They were doing that so that they could kick people off the plantations and fire them and that kind of stuff. And during the meeting, we had another one of those moments where people would sing songs about not letting them turn them around, and after every song, somebody would get up and talk about an experience that they had had. And eventually this guy, I guess he was a middle-aged guy or something, he gets up and he was telling them about his situation. And the situation was that he had been on this farm for ages, sharecropper, and he had gone over to try to register to vote. And now the owner was telling him that he had a few days to find some place to go. He's got this family, several kids. He's got no job, no transportation, no actual place to go. And he tells these people, don't do anything for me, don't worry about me. Just get out there and try to register and vote. Man, it was one of those moments that you have out there. And they raised money for the guy. James Farm was there, Evers was there, and some of them, they would say that more money would be coming. But that was the kind of pressure these people were actually living under. You had the police and fire trucks running up and down outside the church with the bells clanging and ringing and shooting people's pictures so they could turn them over to the bosses. And people were getting fired left and right. People with no money, no funds, no place to go. So they were paying a real heavy price down there. And you didn't hear about those stories a lot of times, but they were going on. And, you know, some of the bravest people out there were guys like Moses, sneak guys who would settle down in these little towns and stay for weeks. You know, I'd go out here on a story and things cool off a little bit, you know. I was gone back to Baltimore. But these people were there day in and day out. And I don't know how some of them did it.
Let me ask you both about a experience where you were very, very close to some very, very tough history, which was the Freedom Ride. And I'm interested if you can think back about how each of you first was asked to consider participating in the bus ride as a journalist. Do you remember who first reached out to you, or how the
on
contact was made?
the Freedom Ride, I went to Farmer and said, look, I want to go with you to see what happens with a photographer. And we went not as participants, but as observers. But I don't know there was any difference, because people didn't take time to say he's observer or participant. And that was an eye-opener. And we went all the way. We went from Washington after the Selma in that area, when one bus was burned, and Mosey was on that bus, I was on the other bus. But when we got to Birmingham, I looked out the window, I could see this crowd, these people with chains and all that kind of stuff. I ducked out the back of the bus and luckily hailed a black cab driver who took me to, can't think of the guy's name.
Reverend Shuttleworth's house.
Shuttleworth's house, that's right. And called Kennedy's office and said, man, you got to get down here. These people are in trouble.
Yeah.
And they said, well, you saved lives. Well, that was secondary. That was a real experience. But my contribution, I hope, I'm just finishing a book of my experiences on the front line, and in another 2 or 3 months, I hope to be able to take it to an agent and say, look, can we get this published?
Wonderful.
But in it, I put in a lot of material. It's not in any of the books on the rise of blacks, because I was in many different events and at different angles, where you could see a lot of problems you didn't see from this area, but you saw over here.
Right. And one follow-up on, because you were in D.C. as bureau chief, you were able to forge some relationships with people inside the administration.
Yeah, I had a lot of contact with the administration, with the FBI. Oh, I got all kinds of close knits with the presidents, you know, with the administration, with the department, and you could see what you could do. Plus, I was a slick fellow in those days, not anymore. I was a Westinghouse radio commentator 3 times a week. So what the black community, I could get over in the white community and do things to explain what blacks were doing here. And that really opened up a lot of that. I could see where, you know, blacks had a little press, the daily press, but you get over here and dropping a commentary on some subject would create as much stir as it would in the black community. Yeah. So I played a lot of kind of games in those days. I'm too old to do that now.
Newson, how did you get it?
I always used to like to work with Simeon Booker, because he was always a guy you could depend on, and you didn't have to worry about some guy trying, you know, going out there and saying something or doing something that would get you in more trouble than you were already in just being out there. We got a call from Jim Farmer. He wanted someone to come out 2 weeks and go on the journey with them, and I agreed to go. At the time, I had already accepted invitation to come down to New Orleans to cover a voting rights hearing that was being held by the Civil Rights Commission. So the day they left, on May 4th, 1961, I had gone down to do that story, and came back and had a few things to do in the office. So I didn't catch up with the Freedom Riders until they were at North Carolina A&T College. I'd just like to mention a little story that I did down in North Carolina. It's one of those stories that don't get much play. We had a registrar there who was testifying over and over and over how she would give these little simple tests, and all the white people could pass the test, but none of the black people could pass the test. And that's why none of them were being registered there in that area of Louisiana. So the lawyers from the Civil Rights Commission, they got her on the stand and they started asking her some of these little simple questions that and she said that the black applicants couldn't answer, and a few other little simple questions. And she sat there and she couldn't answer any of those questions. Not any of them. And we ran a big headline all the way across the paper saying that Dixie voter official flunks on test. And you know, that's the sort of thing, that's the way things were being done in the South. But after I caught up with the Freedom Riders, what they were doing, you know, mixed groups would go off 2s and 3s at the time and go into these stations to test to see whether they could use the facilities and that sort of thing. I guess I shouldn't go through a long story, but there had been 3 rulings that made it possible for them to do this. Corps had tried it back in '47 and didn't get too far because they really didn't have the legal support. And before then, there was a woman out of Baltimore who was coming out of Virginia, and she refused to give up her seat. So she won a case in 1946 that dealt with inter-travel. After that, there was the Rosa Parks situation. About 10 years later, the Rosa Parks situation down in Montgomery. And eventually, 4 women represented by Attorney Fred Gray. Neither of them was Mrs. Parks, whose arrest had led to this famous boycott over a year long. That was the most incredible thing. The world had never seen anything like that in the United States, where these people got together and refused to ride the buses for that sort of period. But these 4 women who were plaintiffs in this case, they won an intra-travel case. Then after that, this young fellow named Bruce Boynton, he refused to give up his seat in one of the bus stations. And that resulted in a case that covered facilities. So now you had the three things done. So when I watched them for a while, and the first real blood I saw out there was now Congressman John Lewis. They got down to a little place, Rock Hill, South Carolina, and he went in. And a couple other people went in with him. 2 white people went in with him, and they got attacked and got thrown out of that place. And Lewis was pretty bloody when he came out. Shortly after that, when we were in Atlanta, Martin Luther King came over. People would have these meetings, you know, where they would greet the Freedom Riders and that sort of thing. Not everybody was happy about what was going on, but Martin Luther King had told our good friend Simeon Booker here and some others that he had heard that the KKK and others were planning to see that the Freedom Riders never got out of Alabama alive. And that was a pretty serious situation. So to make matters worse, the day we were going to be leaving for Anniston, Alabama, and that bus was going to be leaving to go another route headed for Birmingham, James Farmer learned that his father had died and his mother wanted him to come back right away. So we had that situation where we didn't have our main leader there, but they were going to push on anyway. I was on the Greyhound bus that day, and out on the road, another Greyhound bus hailed us down and told us there was a pretty nasty mob up at Anniston, Alabama station, at the Anniston, Alabama Greyhound station. And when we got there, sure enough, there was a pretty angry mob there. And man, they were calling freedom riders all kind of names, and you know, niggers and communists, and come on out and integrate Alabama and that sort of stuff. They were beating on the bus with chains and sticks and whatever else they had. The bus driver had to take care of the business there, but he would lock the door when he got out so nobody could get on the bus. And I guess I had another one of those little experiences. There was a woman on the bus that knew nothing about the Freedom Ride. She was coming home from a funeral. She was sitting across the aisle from me, and she was saying things like, "Why are they doing this to us? And I don't want to die here like this." And she was down on her knees between the two seats there. So I go over and try to tell her what was going on and sort of thing, and still watching the windows because they were trying to break out the windows there. And she told me I could use her name in my story. Her name is Roberta Holmes, I believe. And eventually, bus driver got back in and we took off. And by the time we got to the edge of the city, you heard that sound of tires going down. And you could look back and you could see a line of cars that were following us. And there was a little roadster that stayed in front of the bus to keep the bus from picking up speed. So we were sort of trapped there. That's when we found out that there were a couple of white state troopers on the bus. So we didn't know about it. They were in plain clothes. And they started again breaking out windows and banging on the bus and daring people to come out and that sort of thing. One of these guys, one of the state officers, L. Cowlin, he pulled his pistol and stood in the doorway to keep anybody from getting on the bus. And that sort of saved us because they finally made a break through one of the windows, and they threw this firebomb thing in the seat just behind me, which is an empty seat. And I got a few burns on the back of the ear and that sort of thing, but nothing serious. Suddenly, it was pitch black on that bus. And a couple of people got out of windows and caught rides. Several of us was sort of trapped on the bus there until we could get out. I said, well, I'm going to be the last guy off this bus. Nobody gets trapped on here. So I just put a handkerchief over my mouth and nose and that sort of thing and hung around as long as I could. And it started getting hot on there. It was time to get off. So we got off. And I tell you, when you stepped off that bus and you looked around and you saw these people crawling around trying to get the smoke out of their chests, and people crawling and coughing and gagging. It was one of those sights that make you wonder why Americans are doing that sort of thing to fellow Americans who are just trying to exercise their rights. But eventually, that bus burned right down, broad open daylight. They burned down this expensive Greyhound bus. By the time I got off and saw these people shooting pictures, I realized that I had stuck my camera up under the seat. It's pretty dangerous to be getting off in that situation with a camera around your neck. So it burned up with the bus, but I was able to contact the Greyhound company and get the bus back and get the camera back. It's been on view now over at the museum in Washington, where people can see it if they want to. But that was a pretty shaky occasion. The ones of us who were on that bus, most of us, the ones who didn't get out and catch rides, we were taken to the hospital there in the city. And we were just sort of stuck there. The young guy who was in charge of the bus, in the absence of former Joe Perkins, he was calling all around trying to get somebody to help us get out of there. Hospital, they were telling you can't stay here, and the police were saying we could only protect you to the city lines. And it was kind of dark out there, and we could hear those people out there still hanging around. Eventually, he reached Reverend Shuttlesworth over in Birmingham, and he agreed to send over a caravan of cars to get us out of there. And while we were waiting around, at the time, the Afro-American was doing about 13 editions. The national edition went to press on Sunday night, so I was able to step outside and get a telephone and call the night editor, tell him what kind of story I would have the next day, and ask him to call my wife and tell her that I was okay. But it's kind of tough duty sometimes out there.
That sure is. Let's take a little break, John.
You got to talk more, man.
Oh man, I'm doing fine.
We're back on after a short break. I want to pick up on that day, May the 14th, 1961. I'm just so struck by how so close each of you came to, the prospect of just very serious injury or death in Anniston, and then when you stepped off that bus in Birmingham at the terminal, of course people were getting beaten so badly, and somehow folks just missed catching a look at you before you could get in that cab.
Well, they didn't get much of a chance. The cab just happened to show up, and once it showed up, I was gone. But it was a very close moment.
Yeah.
But we had so many close moments, because that was part of the life. Yeah. And you just accepted it.
Right. I wonder. I'm thinking about the stretch of time between the Freedom Ride and the March on Washington. Those couple of years, and I remember. The speech that John Lewis gave at the March on Washington, and it was full of so much frustration with the federal government for its reluctance, the Kennedy administration for its reluctance to step in and aid people in the South who were suffering white violence. And I'm wondering kind of how each of you felt coming out of an experience like the Freedom Rides, and what perspectives you came away with on that question or others, just what it left you feeling and thinking.
Go on, Simeon.
Well, my angle was to dig deeper in coverage of this underclass of blacks, open it up some more of them, give an opportunity. That's the only way you're going to do anything, because if people can't get education and training, they don't get jobs or this or that. And so we at Jet and Ebony tried to educate and reach them, inspire them to send their kids to school, take an interest in education, cleanliness, health, all those things. But that's a sort of an inward process. But it's one that you have to use as brother to sister for it to work. And you don't get a lot of press or play because it's not front page news. And that's one of the real problems that you have.
I think there was another one of those situations where the ambitions and the aspirations of black people didn't exactly coincide with the administration's viewpoints, how they saw their own jobs and what this kind of thing, how it could affect them in a different way. There was just so many things that the general public didn't know about that reporters were able to learn some of the background about things that J. Edgar Hoover was doing at the Justice Department. You know, we saw these guys out there, FBI guys, watching, but then they would come to you later and ask you what happened out there. You know, particularly at Little Rock, man, when I'm trying to get away. Some guy come by later that night, you know, to ask me what took place, and I saw him standing over on the sidewalk. But man, here again, you know, not just to keep singling out one person. I think John Lewis and some of his younger folk weren't too happy with the way that the administration, the Kennedy administration, was trying to slow down some of the efforts at bringing about changes. And that became quite an issue there. But the march was one of the historic things. I was sort of happy. It didn't happen often, but I was, it was close by Baltimore, so I took my wife and a neighbor who was the wife of one of our photographers, went along and were able to get that, see and take part in that event. But it was a great event, and sometimes now you look back on it, you got to hear Martin Luther King a lot of this thing that turned out to be so great he had done over and over a number of times. But when he got rolling that day, the circumstances was so much different, you know, with all these white Union people and church leaders and everybody else bringing themselves together to demand that changes be made. It took on a completely different light, and the impact of it was just great. It was just great, and he's another guy that people don't understand what he was going through a lot of times. I know shortly before his death, they were planning the Poor People's March on Washington, and I went down to Atlanta to interview him, and as usual, he was running late, and he and Andy Young had to catch a flight after they finally came out of this big meeting with all these people, poor people, Indians, Latinos, and whatnot. So I had to interview him actually in a car going to the airport. And that's kind of different, you know. You got Andy Young there, you got his wife there, you got Harry Belafonte there, and you're trying to interview him about some of the problems that was going on. You know, the FBI was taping him and leaking stuff. Some of the civil rights leaders were saying that his position on the war was causing him to lose sight of what he was doing, and that sort of thing. They were having trouble raising money at the time. And so, you know, eventually I just had to ask him, what's your reaction to all this thing that people are saying that you're sort of failing at what you're supposed to be doing? And he said something that really struck me. You know, he said that, and I was surprised to hear it, he said, if I'm failing, then you might say, according to the way some people look at it, that Jesus Christ failed because he got himself hung on the cross. And, you know, I think that story ran about the middle of March in the year that he died. It was just a few weeks before he died. And it was sort of a strange thing, you know, that, but he was under a lot of stress that a lot of people didn't know and didn't appreciate, that he was struggling under all the charges about communist associations and all the rumors, the type of stuff that a lot of people hadn't printed before, that they started printing and to try to bring him down. But he was quite an interesting guy, and he's a brave guy. Not an awful lot of people would have gone through what he went through, and kept the front that he kept out there, and plugging away as he plugged away day after day. Yeah. Sort of admired the guy.
Yeah. Mr. Booker, do you have special recollections of Martin Luther King and thoughts on, you know, all the work you did covering the movement and Reverend King?
Well, he was a very unusual man. I've never seen him disappointed or defeated. He always seemed to be on the make, on the go. He never, I couldn't ever figure it out, he never gave up. And he was in some very difficult situations. But he always stayed out with a little prayer to himself, and he kept on. A lot of people said, oh, hell with it, going on, done something else. Never did. He stayed with it.
Either of you cover Malcolm X?
No, I didn't. That was an area, Malcolm X, Stokey, that whole crowd, I never paid much attention to. I was at the whole deal was to grab the press attention. They were in it, they knew how to grab a certain section of it. And the rest was Roy Wilkins, Whitney. And I remember Whitney when he died somewhere in Europe. I had to fly over on a plane, pick up his body.
Nigeria.
That was sad.
Nigeria.
Yeah, wherever.
Yeah. I think we were on that flight together. We went down on Air Force One. President Nixon flew down to participate in the services down there for Whitney Young. And Simeon and I were among the people who went down to cover that event.
Mr. Newson, let me take you back for just a minute. Is there more that you'd like to add about, obviously we could talk for hours on this theme, but are there other things that come to your mind when you think about Martin Luther King, covering him over the years?
No, actually, I didn't get to cover him too much. Mm-hmm. We had a staff in Baltimore, and usually when he came to Baltimore, he was covered by some of the other staff people there. I sat in on a lot of the speeches he was making, but I didn't actually cover him. It was fascinating to see him and Abernathy working together. Abernathy would pass the basket and collect the money, and King would make those great speeches that he was known for. But they were quite a twosome when they were working together. I was down in Alabama in the black belt there for a while after King died, and Abernathy was trying to carry on his work, and it just wasn't working, you know, the way everyone had hoped it would. But he gave it his best shot at it, but you know, he didn't have the personality that Dr. King had.
Was either of you either of you covered the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City in August of '64 with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party controversy?
No.
No?
I covered 4 conventions, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. There was a couple in Miami Beach and New York, and that significant one and the Republican one in Kansas, in Missouri there, when the conservative wing took over the party.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't do 64.
One more question, then we can take a little break and come back and finish up. I'm interested in your thoughts about evolving relations between black journalists and white journalists and the earliest efforts at beginning now to staff some black journalists onto larger white papers in just past this period. Interested in your thoughts on the relations between black press and the white press.
Oh, I thought there was a relationship, and they had different standards. The white press would pick off the prominent black whatever. The black press, they would kind of local politics and all. But it was a very difficult kind of thing, standards. There weren't any standards that fitted the whole of it. But you're talking about conventions. I covered all the conventions, but so long ago, I wouldn't remember one of them. My memory is good.
I don't know. I suppose I didn't have the usual contact that a lot of the other reporters we had would have. I was, after I went to Baltimore, I was only on the beat for about a year, and then I got moved into the office and one editor's job, one editor's position or another. So before that, when I was in Memphis, I knew quite a few of the guys. In covering stories, it was somewhat different because normally they would stay at some hotel or something, or some motel that would be sort of a central headquarters for a lot of them. We were not able to stay at those places. Some of the guys we got along when we were working. I could answer some things for them sometimes. They could help me with things sometimes on meetings that I wasn't able to get to. But by and large, it was a professional relationship, I would call it. I didn't do a lot of hanging out with anybody, and particularly the first 5 years, I spent a lot of time down in Mississippi. And, you know, their papers were carrying things which were pretty much opposite to what I was writing and what I was emphasizing. They were emphasizing something else, and frankly, you didn't know who was who. And there was no need to be, you know, blabbing a lot with people. You didn't know who they were or what they were writing, you know, what was going on. So I didn't really go out of my way to try to have a great social relationship with them.
Take a little break.
We're back.
Okay, we're back after a little break. We're just going to finish up. Mr. Newson, Mr. Booker, I want to ask for your thoughts about being print reporters in an era when television came on to really do so much to impact the way that the American public at large reacted to the civil rights story, and also, well, let me just open with that, and any thoughts or reflections you might have on that question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when the white press really became involved in covering the civil rights story as a movement, nothing greater could have happened. They had the TV networks, and that was just invaluable. They would show how people were being treated. They did some great interviews, but I always had the feeling that Americans as a whole, although they were not really anxious to see the changes take place that were taking place, deep down there was sort of a feeling in America that justice was important and treating people a certain way was important. And when those screens were showing people being beaten, forced down by hoses and trampled over by horses, I think it had a great impact, and it was something that the black press could not do at the time. And those pictures and some of the coverage too showed a great effort to get people thinking a different way, and I think it was very successful. I don't think the movement would have been able to do the things it did and at the speed that it was done without those images. And they were just greatly important to moving things to where it is now. Yeah. The media as a whole have been quite helpful. I still have some questions sometimes about some of the coverage, but I won't get into that. But it's just a long story. But I'll tell you one example was the story involving the professor up at Harvard and the way it was treated. It was a disorderly conduct thing that would not have stood up any court in this country, because courts had said that American citizens can call policemen a name, you can yell at a policeman, you can demand to see his ID, and that's all that the sergeant charged him with. The press told us, the media told us in great details that black officer at the scene was 100% behind the sergeant, and that his commander said he was just doing what he was trained to do. But nobody was emphasizing in the mainstream media that this was such a bad arrest that it wouldn't hold up in any court, anywhere. I mean, for decades, these rulings had been made, quite obviously. And the mainstream press didn't do the job on it that a lot of blogs were doing, that a lot of cable stations were doing. And, you know, I'm talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post. They weren't telling people that this was a case that would not stand up in any court. Most of them didn't even tell you why the case was dropped. They just said that it was dropped and the charges were dropped. But you know, but the media have done a great job. But from time to time, you see covers that is a little bit suspect.
Yeah, that was the Professor Gates.
Yeah,
incident
right.
In 2009, I believe. Yeah.
Henry Louis Gates.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Harvard. Yeah.
Louis Gates.
Mr. Booker, final question. I know in '68, following the assassination of Robert Kennedy, that you had connections to the Kennedys and to Robert Kennedy, and I think participated in his funeral in 1968, after Bobby Kennedy's death. Does that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have recollections of that experience?
Well, I think it was a very sad occasion. I think he was the first official of that rank to be sensitive to racial matters and actually did something about it. Others would talk about it, not publicly to us, but he was very frank and did a lot of things. But then he got killed, and it sort of wiped out. Lyndon came along, completely different individual. He just, one, he couldn't accept criticism, and two, he couldn't deal with a whole lot of blacks with different views. He had to be the boss of anything. And so it was, everything ended there. And our whole political structure seemed to disintegrate. And we're now trying to rebuild again, which we finally did when Obama came through. But then it's still splintered on the white side. There's not a unity. So I guess it's the way America will always be.
Well, I hope that I hope that we'll all have a chance to extend our conversation at some point, because it's been just wonderful to be with you both. Thank you so much.
All right,
for
thank
sitting
you.
down today. It's been a real privilege and honor. Thank you.
Okay.
Pleasure.
Hold on a second, and I'll disconnect your microphones.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.